Welcome to the next lesson from the animal behavior course. This is going to be chapter 2.2, and we're going to continue our discussion of animal behavior. So we'll go ahead and jump right in. So in the last lesson, we talked about the primary evolutionary mechanism of natural selection, but today we're going to discuss the other mechanisms. These include adaptations, genetic drift, gene flow or gene migration, and mutation. So the first is adaptations. And this term isn't necessarily a mechanism as much as it is just an overarching sort of theme of evolution. So adaptations are, this is a broad term that means any characteristic, either physical or behavioral, that has developed in an organism to help it better survive in its environment. Almost all adaptations are produced through natural selection, but not all of them. Some can occur by chance or through mutations. Now, this brings up another term that is also important to know. Exaptations are traits that originally evolved for one purpose, but over time they get co-opted for a new function. For instance, bird feathers didn't actually evolve for flight. They probably actually evolved as a mechanism for insulation or maybe mating displays in dinosaurs, and only later were they adapted to help with flying. Acceptations remind us that evolution works with what already exists. It tinkers and repurposes rather than designing traits from scratch. Now, some traits that animals have today are important for their ancestors, but they no longer serve a useful purpose. These are called vestigial traits. For example, humans have an appendix, which can help us to digest tough plant material, but now it's mostly redundant, and that's why you can survive today with your appendix removed. Similarly, wisdom teeth are another example. Our ancestors needed those extra teeth for chewing coarse foods, but today they often cause problems and are typically removed in most people. In animals, we see vestigial traits too. Flightless birds like penguins still have wings, even though they don't use them for flying. Vestigial traits are fascinating because they act sort of like a window into the evolutionary history of an organism. They show us where a species came from and what traits were once useful, but are no longer necessary. Now, there are also maladaptive behavior or maladaptations, one might say, and they become maladaptive because of a changing environment. Maladaptations are likely to occur when man-made changes cause unnatural scenarios to suddenly become common. Basically, a behavior that was beneficial becomes harmful due to the environmental changes. We refer to this situation as what is known as the evolutionary trap. Now, here is an example. The brown jewel bug adapted to reproduce with brown, shiny objects because females are brown and shiny. However, this cue became an issue with the introduction of the beer bottle. Bottles started attempting, basically, bottles would be showing up as litter, and then beetles would start attempting to mate with the bottles, causing sort of a noticeable decline in their reproductive success. Hence, in this evolutionary trap, the behavior of mating with shiny brown objects became maladaptive, even though it was once adaptive. So moving on to the next mechanism, genetic drift. This process occurs when there is a change in the relative frequency of a gene in a population due to some random sampling or random chance. In each generation, some individuals may, just by pure chance, leave behind a few more descendants, and of course their genes, than other individuals. The genes and other genetic elements of the next generation will be those of the lucky individuals, not necessarily the healthy or the better individuals. That, in a nutshell, is genetic drift. So it differs from natural selection because it's a completely random process. I like to think of genetic drift as kind of being, the way that I always say it is genetic drift is random shit. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that, but it does kind of rhyme and it makes sense. Random shit can happen and certain traits can persist. Not because they're adaptive, but purely because they were the lucky trait that got to move on to the next generation. Genetic drift can cause big losses of genetic variation for small populations, and this can lead to what we know now call as either bottleneck or founder effects. Population bottlenecks, which you can see here pictured in this video, in this picture of the bottle, um, is when a population size is reduced from at least one generation. Because genetic drift acts more quickly to reduce genetic variation in small populations, undergoing sort of this bottleneck can reduce a population's genetic variation by quite a lot. And you can see this is illustrated by the bag of the bottle of marbles. It's being emptied out. Only a few surviving individuals persist, and a lot more of them just so happen by random chance had the blue gene rather than the yellow gene, and so the next generation has a lot more of the blue gene. Whether or not the blue gene was actually more beneficial toward the reproductive success of the organism. This does occur, and it has been documented in nature. For example, the northern elephant seal has experienced reduced genetic variation because of a population bottleneck inflicted by humans in the 1890s. Hunting of the northern elephant seal reduced their population size to as little as 20 individuals by the end of the 19th century. Their population has since rebounded to over 30,000, but their genes still carry the marks of this bottleneck. They have much less genetic variation than a population of southern elephant seals that was not hunted as intensely as the northern elephant seals. And so that is a real life example of what happens when a population experiences this really thinning down of genetic diversity. Now, the founder effect is similar but slightly different. It's when a small group of individuals colonizes a new area, and that's why it's called the founder effect. And essentially what happens is in this population's new gene pool, it will only reflect the traits of the founders, those that founded the new population. This small population size means that the colony may have reduced genetic variation from the original population, and specifically in terms of evolution, a non-random sample of genes in the original population. This is, like I said, very similar to the bottleneck. But essentially, you're getting a small sample, and instead of it going through some sort of environmental or human-made impact, it's individuals kind of colonizing a new area. So, for example, some of the Darwin finches arrived on the Galapagos Islands as a small group, and then these founding birds had particular behaviors like the way they foraged or sang. And because only those traits were present in the founders, those behaviors became much more common in that island population, regardless of whether they were actually beneficial initially or not. And so you'll actually see this as a very common effect in island species. And so if you're looking at an island species, you can that maybe is behaving in a unique or different way, you could likely assume that there was some level of genetic drift, specifically the founder effect, taking place. The next mechanism is gene flow, or also called gene migration. And this is when individuals or their genes move from one population to another. This introduces new genetic variation, which then evolution can act upon. For example, pollen can travel to new plant populations, or humans can migrate and interbreed with other groups. A famous case of this, I don't know if anyone in the class has ever taken sort of 23andMe or any one of those sort of genetic testing companies or those tests. People might find that they have 1-2% of Neanderthal DNA. And so this is actually a really famous example of gene flow. There was interbreeding between Neanderthals and our Homo sapien populations, which influenced traits, things like immune function, metabolism, and even some skin variation today. And so in short, gene flow helps populations share genes, increasing variation and sometimes affecting important traits, although not always. Sometimes the observable impacts of gene migration are not necessarily prevalent or observable. Now, gene flow typically requires some geographic barrier, and good thing humans are quite good at making those. But the thing is, there are other barriers that can actually prevent gene flow. And so gene flow happens when individuals or their genes move between populations, but physical barriers, such as the Great Wall of China, can be created and actually restrict gene flow. which once again can affect evolution. And so studies around the Great Wall of China have found that certain species of plants and animals on either side after the wall was created have shown a very large reduction in genetic mixing. And so over time, the populations on one side are completely different and even genetically distinct from populations on the other side. And so this is sort of just highlighting how man-made structures, just like mountains or rivers or other things, can affect evolution in the way species evolve, and specifically how gene migration is a big component and a big and very important mechanism for how species diversity comes to be and how species come to evolve. And so by cutting those things off, we can see different species kind of divert into their own individual species without any of that mixing. And so the last mechanism, the final mechanism that we're going to talk about that is not natural selection, are mutations. And so mutations are changes in the information contained in the genetic material. For most organisms, this means a change in their sequence of DNA. But in organisms' DNA, sorry, let me backtrack. For most organisms, this means a change in the sequence of DNA. Now, an organism's DNA affects how it looks, sometimes how it behaves, its physiology, basically all aspects of its life. So a change in DNA can produce changes in any of these traits. Mutations can be beneficial, they can be neutral, or they can be harmful. But it's important to remember that mutations do not try to supply the organism with what it needs. Just like random genetic drift, they are random. Whether a mutation happens is unrelated to how useful it would be. A classic example is the panther. Sorry, this may be a bit of an unfun fact, but panthers are not a real species. They're actually a term that's used to refer to any cat that has a genetic mutation that causes their coat to be very dark in color. There are jaguar panthers, there are leopard panthers, there are even puma panthers. So if you root for the Carolina Panthers, you are rooting for an imaginary animal and also currently not such a great team. But maybe one day they can become one. Anyways, a panther. So a panther is just a rare mutation that causes a very dark coat. This mutation may provide an advantage in dense forest habitats, or maybe making the jaguar or whatever cat has the mutation harder to spot. And so because of this, the trait can persist and even spread in a population because panthers can pass on their genetic mutation to offspring. And so mutations like this are essential because they introduce new variation into populations. But I will also say there are also a lot of mutations that can be harmful, and most mutations are actually neutral. A lot of people have a lot of mutations in their body that even today, so same with animals, but that you'll never ever notice that they actually do anything because they're completely neutral. And so variation can be introduced through mutations, and then natural selection can actually act upon that variation and cause sort of a change in species or a change in traits. Here is just some different types of mutations. You don't actually need to know any of this for this course, but I know a lot of people are really sort of into genetics, and so these are sort of just the different kinds of mutations that can occur within chromosomes. All right, so this is the point. At this point, we've now covered 5 of the main mechanisms that are involved in evolution. In the last lesson, we covered natural selection, right? This idea of survival of the fittest. Survival of the fittest and natural selection can often create what are called adaptations, which are just a sort of a broad characteristic of traits or behaviors that help an organism survive in its environment. We also covered genetic drift, which is just random shit that can result in either a bottleneck or a founder effect. We also talked about gene flow and gene migration, which is sort of the movement of genes from one population to another to introduce genetic variation, which natural selection can then act upon. And then lastly, we have mutations, which although most are neutral, some can result in physical or behavioral changes in traits, and those traits can then be acted upon by natural selection. And so the animal quiz password, or sorry, the quiz password for this lesson's quiz is animal. And I hope you guys enjoyed this lesson, and I'm looking forward to future lessons. I hope this was helpful.